Look it up. Tim Coleman screamed, kicking the plastic bucket across the room. Dirty gray water splashed across the boardroom table, soaking Aeola's yellow rubber gloves. 10 years of invisible service destroyed in seconds. 120 executives went silent. Then, one by one, phones appeared. Tim strode toward her and pointed a shaking finger at the wet carpet. "I want everyone to witness this," he announced, his veins bulging. "This is what happens when you are incompetent." Shock rippled through the room. Aeola felt her legs tremble. "Get on your knees," Tim continued coldly. "You ruined my merger. You don't leave this room until this floor is dry. Use your tongue if you have to." Laughter broke through the crowd. Aeola's vision blurred. The floor tilted. She collapsed right there in her gray uniform. The double doors swung open. Lee Min-jin had been watching. While everyone focused on the humiliation, he moved through the crowd like smoke, knelt beside Aeola, and lifted her into his arms. He slid one hand under her back and the other under her knees. He lifted her effortlessly, her dirty uniform pressing against his pristine white shirt. "Who the hell are you?" Tim's voice boomed across the table. Lee turned slowly. Tim was staring at him, his fingers still pointing aggressively. The entire boardroom had gone silent again. 120 executives watched the stranger in the open collar shirt hold their janitor like she was a queen. "Put the help down," Tim demanded. He stepped forward, blocking the exit. "This is a closed meeting." Lee stopped walking. He turned his head just enough to look at Tim. The black dragon tattoo on his neck seemed to move with his pulse. "This is not a meeting anymore," Lee said quietly. "It is a funeral for your career." Tim's face went bright red. "Do you know who I am?" "I am the VP of Operations." "Yes, I know," Lee said. His voice was a murmur, but it cut through every whisper in the room. "You are Tim Coleman. You have a mortgage in the Hamptons and a gambling debt in Macau." Tim stopped walking. His expression shifted from anger to terror. "I own the bank that holds your mortgage," Lee continued calmly. "And I own the casino that holds your debt. My name is Lee Min-jin, and I bought this company 10 minutes ago." No one in the boardroom moved. No one spoke. No one even seemed to breathe. 120 executives stood frozen with their phones recording everything. Lee looked at Tim for 3 more seconds, just long enough to watch the man's soul leave his body. "Let the janitor go," Lee murmured. Then he turned and carried Aeola out of the glass doors while 120 people watched and did absolutely nothing to help. Before we continue with the story, I would like you to do me a favor. Kindly hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where you are watching from because this story is about to change in ways nobody expects. The ballroom on the top floor of the Celestial Tower was not a place for mistakes. It was a place for money. The air smelled like expensive perfume and cold cash. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, casting a golden glow on the 120 executives gathered for the biggest merger of the decade. They held glasses of champagne that cost more than Aeola's monthly rent. Aeola Badmus tried to make herself as small as possible. She moved silently through the crowd, her gray eyes fixed on the floor. Her yellow rubber gloves were tight on her hands, holding a spray bottle and a rag. She was invisible to them. They looked right through her as if she were part of the furniture. Aeola didn't mind. Invisibility was safe. Invisibility meant she could keep her job, pay her bills, and survive another day in a city that wanted to chew her up. She stepped carefully around a group of men laughing loudly near the ice sculpture. Suddenly, a heavy shoulder slammed into her back. It was accidental, careless, but the force was enough to send her stumbling forward. Aeola gasped as her foot caught on the plush carpet. She pitched forward, her arms flailing to catch her balance. The spray bottle flew from her hand. The dirty rag slapped onto the polished shoe of the man standing in front of her. But the worst part was the tray of crystal glasses on the nearby table. Aeola's hip bumped the edge. One glass wobbled. Then it tipped. The sound of shattering glass cut through the laughter like a gunshot. Champagne exploded across the black Italian leather shoes of Tim Coleman. The cold liquid soaked his socks and splashed up the hem of his tailored pants. The room went dead silent. Tim Coleman looked down at his shoes. His face turned a deep, ugly shade of purple. The vein in his forehead began to throb. He looked like a balloon about to pop. He slowly lifted his gaze to Aola, who was frozen in horror. Her hands were shaking so hard the yellow gloves made a squeaking sound. "I am so sorry, sir," Aola whispered, her voice barely audible. "I will clean it up immediately." She dropped to her knees, reaching for the rag. But before she could touch it, Tim kicked the plastic bucket she had been dragging. Dirty gray water splashed across the expensive carpet and onto Aola's uniform. "Don't you touch me," Tim screamed. His voice echoed off the glass walls. "You stupid, incompetent waste of space. Look what you did." The 120 executives watched in silence. Nobody moved to help. Nobody said a word. They just watched the show. Tim stepped closer, looming over her. "This is a $5,000 suit," he hissed, spitting the words at her. "And you just ruined it with your clumsiness." Aola shrank back, tears stinging her eyes. She wanted to disappear. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. "I didn't mean to," she stammered. "It was an accident." Tim laughed, a cruel, barking sound. "An accident? You are the accident." He pointed a shaking finger at the puddle of champagne and dirty water mixed on the floor. "You want to fix it? Then clean it up. But don't use a rag. That's too good for you." He sneered, his eyes full of malice. "Lick it up. Lick it dry. Or I will make sure you never work in this city again." The silence in the room was heavy, suffocating. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the building. Aola stared at the wet carpet, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She felt dizzy. The humiliation burned her skin hotter than fire. She slowly bent forward, defeated. She had no choice. She needed this job. She needed to survive. Just as she was about to humiliate herself completely, a sound broke the tension. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a scream. It was the sound of the heavy double doors at the entrance swinging open. The heavy would hit the stoppers with a dull thud. Every head in the room turned. A man stood in the doorway. He was tall, with broad shoulders that filled the frame. He wore a white dress shirt, crisp and bright, with the top buttons undone. "No tie. No jacket." Just effortless power. It was Lee Min-jin. He didn't look at the crowd of executives. He didn't look at the stunning view of the city skyline. His dark, steady eyes locked onto the scene in the center of the room. He saw the spilled water. He saw the terrified woman on her knees in yellow gloves. And he saw Tim Coleman standing over her like a tyrant. Lee began to walk. He moved with a strange, liquid grace, like a predator stalking through tall grass. The crowd of 120 executives parted for him instantly, creating a wide path. They scrambled to get out of his way, terrified to even brush against his sleeve. Lee stopped 3 feet away from Aola. He looked at Tim. "Let the janitor go," Lee murmured. The voice was soft, but it hit the room like a thunderclap. Tim Coleman blinked. He was so consumed by his own rage that he didn't realize who was standing in front of him. He only saw a man in a shirt interfering with his power trip. "Excuse me?" Tim sputtered, puffing out his chest. "This is a private event. And this woman is my employee. She ruined my property, and I am teaching her a lesson." Tim took a step forward, pointing his finger at Lee's chest. "So, why don't you mind your own business before I call security?" The gasp from the crowd was audible. Someone in the back whispered, "Oh my God." Lee didn't even blink. He didn't look at Tim's finger. He calmly stepped past him and knelt beside Aola. He reached out a hand. His skin was pale and smooth, a stark contrast to her yellow rubber glove. Stand up, he said gently. Aola looked at him, confused and frightened, but something in his eyes made her trust him. She took his hand, and he pulled her to her feet. Then, in one smooth motion, he scooped her up into his arms. He held her bridal style, her dirty uniform pressing against his expensive shirt. He turned back to Tim. You are not calling security, Lee said, his voice void of emotion. And you are not teaching anyone a lesson. Tim opened his mouth to argue, but Lee cut him off. You are fired, Lee stated simply. And as of 2 minutes ago, I have frozen your bank accounts. Crown Capital holds your debt, Tim. And I am Crown Capital. You are bankrupt. Tim's face went white. The color drained from his skin so fast, he looked like a ghost. He staggered back, his mouth opening and closing with no sound coming out. Lee Min-jin turned his back on Tim Coleman. He didn't wait for a response. He didn't wait for an apology. Men like Tim didn't deserve his time. He tightened his grip on Aola, pulling her slightly closer to his chest. She was stiff in his arms, her eyes wide with shock, holding her breath as if she were afraid to exhale. Breathe, he whispered to her, so low that only she could hear it. You are safe now. He began to walk toward the exit. The only sound in the massive ballroom was the rhythmic click of his shoes on the marble floor. The 120 executives were statues. They stood frozen, clutching their phones, their eyes wide. As Lee walked past them, the collar of his shirt shifted slightly. The intricate black ink of a dragon tattoo was visible, winding up his neck and disappearing behind his ear. The symbol of the dragon, the mark of the underworld. The executives saw it, and the fear in the room spiked. They realized this wasn't just a businessman. This was a king. They watched him carry the janitor through the lobby, past the gold statues, and out the glass doors. The cool night air hit Lee's face as the valet scrambled to open the back door of a sleek black SUV. Lee gently lowered Aola into the leather seat. She looked up at him, her brown eyes searching his face for answers. Who are you? She whispered, her voice trembling. Lee didn't answer immediately. He just looked at her with a sadness that didn't match his scary reputation. He closed the car door, shutting out the world of the executives forever. Aola opened her eyes and gasped. She wasn't in her tiny apartment with the leaky faucet. She was lying in a bed so soft it felt like a cloud. The sheets were silk, cool and smooth against her skin. She sat up quickly, her heart pounding. The room was huge. One entire wall was made of glass, showing the glittering city lights far below. It looked like a palace. Panic seized her chest. Had she been kidnapped? She looked down and saw she was still wearing her gray uniform, though her yellow gloves were gone. She scrambled out of bed, looking for a way out. You're awake, a calm voice said. Aola spun around. Lee Min-jin was standing in the kitchen area of the open suite. He looked different. The fierce dragon tattoo was hidden under a soft gray sweater. He didn't look like a scary mafia boss anymore. He looked normal. He was holding a steaming mug. I made tea, he said, walking toward her slowly, so he wouldn't scare her. Chamomile. It helps with shock. Aola backed away until she hit the glass wall. Where am I? She asked, her voice shaking. Why am I here? Lee stopped and set the mug on a small table. You are in my home, he said gently. You fainted in the car. I didn't know where you lived, and I couldn't leave you on the street. His eyes were kind, not cold like they had been in the boardroom. Please, he said, gesturing to the tea. Drink. You're safe here, Aola. I promise. Aola stared at the tea, then at the door. I need to go home, she said, smoothing down her wrinkled uniform. My landlord will worry. And I need to find a new job. She started walking toward the elevator, but Lee stepped in front of her. He didn't block her aggressively. He just stood there. You cannot go out there, he said. He picked up a remote and turned on the massive TV on the wall. The screen lit up with breaking news. Aola saw her own face. It was a video from the boardroom, showing Tim screaming at her and Lee carrying her out. The headline read, "Mystery Billionaire Rescues Janitor from CEO Bully." Reporters were swarming outside her apartment building. "They are everywhere," Lee explained. "If you go home now, they will eat you alive." Aola felt her knees go weak. "So I'm trapped," she whispered. Lee shook his head.
No.
"Not trapped. Protected." He looked at her with a strange intensity. "I have a proposition," he said. "Stay here. In the guest suite. I have plenty of room." Aola laughed nervously. "And do what? Clean your floors?" Lee looked pained. "No," he said firmly.
No cleaning.
"Just exist. Live here. Keep me company." He looked away, staring out at the lonely city. "This place is too big for one person. And I am very tired of being alone." The next morning, the world had changed. Aola sat at the marble kitchen island, scrolling through a tablet Lee had given her. The internet was on fire. Tim Coleman was ruined. The video of him screaming "Lick it up" had been viewed 50 million times. People were calling for his arrest. He had lost his job, his reputation, and, according to the news, his wife had left him that morning. Aola felt a strange mixture of relief and guilt. She had never wanted to destroy anyone. She just wanted to do her job. But the internet wasn't just talking about Tim.
They were talking about her.
Hashtag Cinderella Janitor was trending worldwide. People were drawing fan art of Lee carrying her. They called her a queen in disguise. "It is overwhelming, isn't it?" Lee asked, walking into the room. He was dressed in a sharp black suit today, ready for business. "They don't even know me," Aola said, putting the tablet down. "They think I'm some fairy tale princess. I'm just a janitor." Lee poured himself a coffee. "You are not just a janitor," he corrected her. "You are the woman who maintained her dignity while a man screamed in her face. That is rare." He slid a credit card across the counter toward her. "The stylist will be here in an hour," he said. "Get whatever you need. No uniforms allowed in this house." Aola looked at the black card. It had no limit. For the first time in her life, she didn't have to worry about the cost of anything. The stylist was a whirlwind of energy named Marcus. He brought racks of clothes that filled the living room. "Honey, we're going to burn that gray jumpsuit," Marcus declared. For 3 hours, Aola tried on dresses she had only seen in magazines. Silks, velvets, cashmeres. When she finally stepped out of the dressing room, she felt like a different person. She was wearing a simple, elegant dress the color of deep emerald green. It hugged her curves and made her brown skin glow. She had taken her hair down from the tight braids, letting it frame her face softly. Lee walked in just as she was looking in the mirror. He stopped dead in his tracks. He dropped his briefcase on the floor. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. He just stared. His dark eyes traveled from her face to her feet and back up again. The silence stretched out, thick and heavy. Aola felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Is it too much?" she asked shyly. "I can change back." Lee cleared his throat. He looked almost shaken. "No," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Do not change." He took a step closer. "You look..." He struggled to find a word. "You look like you belong here." The air between them crackled with electricity. It wasn't just gratitude anymore. It was attraction. Aola saw the way his eyes darkened, the way his hand twitched at his side like he wanted to reach out. For the first time, the scary mafia boss looked vulnerable. That evening, they were sitting on the plush sofa, watching a movie. It was quiet and peaceful. Aola was starting to relax, forgetting the chaos of the outside world. Lee stood up to get more water. "Do you want anything?" he asked. But before Aola could answer, Lee stumbled. He grabbed the edge of the sofa, his knuckles turning white. He squeezed his eyes shut, a look of pure agony crossing his face.
"Lee,"
Aola asked, sitting up. "Are you okay?" Lee didn't answer. He swayed, his face going pale. He brought a hand to his temple, pressing hard as if trying to keep his head from splitting open. Just a headache, he gasped, his voice tight with pain. But it didn't look like just a headache. It looked like he was being stabbed. Aeola's instincts took over. She had spent years taking care of her sick grandmother. She knew pain when she saw it. She jumped up and guided him back to the sofa. "Sit down," she ordered gently. She ran to the kitchen, soaked a soft cloth in ice water, and returned. She dimmed the lights until the room was pitch black. "Lie back," she whispered. She placed the cold cloth over his eyes. Lee let out a shaky breath, his body relaxing slightly into the cushions. "Thank you," he whispered weakly. Aeola sat on the floor beside him, watching him worriedly. This wasn't normal. Powerful men like Lee Min-jin didn't collapse from headaches. Something was wrong. Aeola insisted on going back to her apartment. She didn't want to stay there, but she needed her things. She needed her grandmother's Bible and the old photo album she kept under her bed. Lee agreed, but he wouldn't let her go alone. "Take the car," he said. It wasn't a request. When Aeola walked downstairs, 3 black SUVs were waiting. 2 men in dark suits opened the door for her. They didn't smile. They didn't speak. They just scanned the street like hawks looking for prey. When they arrived at her crumbling apartment building, the contrast was startling. The shiny, expensive cars looked like spaceships that had landed in the wrong world. Aeola stepped out, feeling self-conscious in her new clothes. A group of young men from the neighborhood, known for causing trouble, started walking toward her. They were loud and aggressive. Aeola felt her stomach tighten. But before she could even take a breath, Lee's security team moved. They didn't pull out weapons. They didn't shout. They simply stepped forward in perfect unison. One guard adjusted his jacket, revealing the handle of a gun. The young men froze. They looked at the guards, then at the cars, and fear washed over their faces. They turned and ran without a word. Aeola realized then that Lee wasn't just a rich businessman. He was a king in a world she didn't understand. These men weren't just bodyguards, they were soldiers. And Lee Min-jin was the general who commanded an army with a single word. It made her feel safe, but it also terrified her to know just how dangerous her new protector really was. Back at the penthouse, the silence felt different. Lee was waiting for her by the window. He looked relieved to see her. "Did you get everything?" he asked. Aeola nodded, holding her small box of treasures. "I stopped for a corn dog on the way back," she said, trying to lighten the mood. The guards wouldn't eat one. Lee looked at her with a blank expression. "What is a corn dog?" he asked. Aeola laughed, thinking he was joking. "You know, hot dog on a stick. Deep fried?" Lee shook his head slowly. "I have never eaten street food," he admitted quietly. "My meals were always prepared by chefs. My schedule was always training and studying." Aeola stopped laughing. She looked at the man who owned half the city, but had never tasted a corn dog. He had power, but he had no fun. He had money, but he had no memories. "That is the saddest thing I have ever heard," Aeola declared. She set her box down on the marble table. "Okay, new plan. We are making a list. A bucket list of normal things." Lee raised an eyebrow. "Normal things?" "Yes," Aeola said firmly. "We're going to eat greasy food until we feel sick. We're going to play video games in a loud arcade. We're going to walk in the rain without an umbrella." Lee looked at her, and a slow smile spread across his face. It wasn't his scary business smile. It was a real smile. "I would like that," he said. "Show me your world, Aeola. Show me what I have been missing." 2 days later, they were at an arcade downtown. Lee had rented the whole place out, so they could be alone, which Aeola said was cheating, but he insisted on safety. He was terrible at the racing games, but surprisingly good at the shooting ones. They were laughing over a game of air hockey when the back door crashed open. Aeola jumped. It was Tim Coleman. He looked awful. His expensive suit was wrinkled and stained. His hair was a mess. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days.
You.
Tim screamed, pointing a shaking finger at Aola. You ruined my life. Before the security guards could reach him, Tim lunged. He grabbed Aola's arm, his fingers digging into her skin painfully. I lost everything because of you, he yelled. Aola cried out in pain. In a split second, the air in the room changed. Lee didn't call for his guards. He didn't shout. He moved like a viper striking its prey. He closed the distance between them in a blur of motion. He grabbed Tim's wrist and twisted it sharply. A loud crack echoed through the arcade. Tim screamed and dropped to his knees. Lee didn't stop. He shoved Tim against the wall, his forearm pressing against Tim's throat, cutting off his air. The dragon had come out. Lee's eyes were dead and cold. I told you, Lee whispered, his voice terrifyingly calm. I told you never to touch her again. He tightened his grip until Tim's face turned purple. Do you want to lose the hand? Or do you want to leave? Tim gasped for air, nodding frantically. Lee threw him to the ground like a bag of trash. The ride back to the penthouse was silent. The fun of the arcade was gone, replaced by the heavy scent of adrenaline and fear. Aola sat in the back of the SUV, rubbing her bruised arm. She was shaking, not just from the attack, but from seeing the violence in Lee's eyes. He had looked like a monster, but he was a monster who protected her. Lee stared out the window, his jaw clenched tight. He looked angry at himself. I am sorry, he said finally, his voice rough. I should have checked the back exit. He should never have gotten that close. He turned to look at her, and his expression crumbled when he saw her holding her arm. Did he hurt you? Lee asked. He reached out, his fingers hovering gently over her bruise. His touch was so light, so careful, completely different from the violence he had just shown Tim.
I'm okay, Aola whispered.
You stopped him. She looked up into his eyes and saw the fear there. He was terrified of losing her. The realization hit her like a wave.
He cared.
He really cared. The space between them seemed to shrink. The air got hot. Without thinking, Aola leaned forward. Lee met her halfway. He kissed her. It wasn't a gentle, movie star kiss. It was desperate and fierce. It tasted like danger and relief. He pulled her close, burying his hands in her hair, as if he needed to prove to himself that she was really there and really safe. For a moment, the world outside the car didn't exist. Later that night, the penthouse was quiet. Lee had gone into the bathroom to take a shower. Aola was in the bedroom, folding the new clothes Marcus had bought her. She felt happy, but also confused. The kiss in the car had changed everything. She wasn't just his guest anymore. She picked up Lee's jacket from the chair to hang it up. As she moved it, something rattled in the inside pocket. A small orange bottle fell out and rolled across the floor. Aola bent down to pick it up. She expected it to be something simple, like aspirin for his headaches. But the label on the bottle was long and complicated. Morphine sulfate. Take for severe pain. She frowned. Morphine was for serious things. Really serious things. Just then, Lee's phone buzzed on the nightstand. Aola glanced at it. It was a text message from a contact named Dr. Matsuda. The preview message popped up on the bright screen. Your blood counts are critically low, Lee. We need to schedule another transfusion immediately. You cannot keep skipping appointments. The tumor is growing. Aola froze. The bottle slipped from her fingers and hit the floor with a dull thud. Her blood ran cold. Transfusions? Tumor? She remembered the terrible headache he had the other night. She remembered how he sometimes stumbled when he thought she wasn't looking. The puzzle pieces clicked together in a horrifying picture. Lee Min-jin wasn't just tired. He wasn't just stressed.
He was sick.
Very, very sick. And he hadn't told her a single word about it. The dinner was supposed to be perfect. Lee had ordered food from the best Italian restaurant in the city, and they were eating by candlelight on the balcony. The city lights twinkled below them like a carpet of diamonds. Aola tried to enjoy the pasta, but her stomach was tied in knots. She kept thinking about the pill bottle she had found. She watched Lee carefully across the table. He looked handsome in the soft light, but he was pale. Too pale. He hadn't touched his wine, and his hand was trembling slightly every time he lifted his fork. "Is the food okay?" Aola asked, her voice quiet. Lee looked up and smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It is delicious," he lied. "I am just tired." He tried to stand up to pour her more water. "Let me get that," he said. But as he stood, his knees buckled. The pitcher of water slipped from his hand and shattered on the tiled floor. Glass and water exploded everywhere. "Lee!" Aola screamed, jumping up. Lee gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. His eyes rolled back in his head. He didn't make a sound as he collapsed. He hit the floor hard, his body convulsing in a terrifying rhythm. Aola threw herself down beside him, ignoring the broken glass that cut into her knees. "Help!" she screamed, even though she knew no one could hear her from the penthouse. She grabbed his hand, which was cold and clammy. "Stay with me, Lee. Please stay with me." The security guards burst through the door seconds later, their faces grim. They knew exactly what to do, which terrified Aola even more. They had done this before. The waiting room of the private hospital was silent and cold. It smelled like antiseptic and fear. Aola sat in a hard plastic chair, her emerald green dress stained with water and a few drops of blood from her knees. She didn't care. She just stared at the clock on the wall. The hands moved too slowly. Every tick felt like a hammer hitting her chest. It had been 2 hours since they wheeled Lee away. Finally, a door opened. Dr. Matsuda walked out. He looked exhausted. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose before looking at Aola. The look in his eyes told her everything she needed to know before he even spoke. "How is he?" Aola whispered, standing up. Her legs felt weak. Dr. Matsuda sighed. "He is stable for now," he said gently, but the seizure was severe. He gestured for her to sit back down. "Lee did not want you to know," the doctor explained. "He has a glioblastoma. It is an aggressive brain tumor." Aola felt the room spin. "Can you operate?" she asked. "Can you cut it out?" Dr. Matsuda shook his head slowly. "No. It is in a part of the brain we cannot touch. We have tried treatments, but they are failing." He paused, looking down at his clipboard. "The tumor is growing fast, Aola. I am sorry." Aola choked back a sob. "How long?" she asked, her voice breaking. "How much time does he have?" Dr. Matsuda looked her in the eye. 3 months, he said softly. "Maybe less. He is dying, Aola." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Aola walked into Lee's hospital room. He was awake, propped up by pillows. He looked smaller than she had ever seen him. The wires and machines beeped around him, a constant reminder of the clock ticking down. When he saw her, he didn't smile. He turned his head away, staring at the blank white wall. "You should not be here," he rasped. His voice was weak, stripped of its usual power. "I told the guards not to let you in." Aola walked to the side of the bed. "I am not going anywhere," she said firmly. She reached for his hand, but he pulled it away. "Go," Lee said, his voice harder this time. "Leave, Aola. Pack your bags and go." He turned to face her, his eyes cold and distant. "This was a mistake. I was selfish. I wanted company, but I do not want an audience for my death." He pointed to the bedside table where a thick envelope sat. "There is money in there. Enough to buy a house. Enough to never scrub a floor again. Take it and leave." Aola stared at the envelope, then at him. Tears streamed down her face. "You are pushing me away," she cried. "You are trying to protect me." Lee closed his eyes. I am trying to save you from watching me rot, he whispered. It is going to get ugly, Aola. I will lose my mind. I will lose my body. You do not want to see that. He took a shaky breath.
Please.
If you care about me, go. Let me die alone. It is what I deserve. Aola left the hospital. She walked for hours through the city streets, clutching the envelope of money Lee had forced on her. She walked until her feet blistered in her expensive shoes. She thought about running. She thought about buying a small house in the countryside and forgetting the dragon and his glass castle. It would be easy. It would be safe. She sat on a park bench and watched an old couple walking hand in hand. They looked happy. They had time. She and Lee didn't have time. But looking at them, she realized something. Love wasn't about the amount of time you had.
It was about what you did with it.
She stood up. She threw the envelope into her purse and hailed a taxi. Take me back to the hospital, she ordered. When she burst into Lee's room, he looked shocked. I told you to go, he said. Aola marched up to the bed. She looked fierce. She looked like a warrior. I scrubbed floors for 10 years, she announced, her voice steady and loud. I cleaned up vomit and mud and trash that rich people left behind. I have never been afraid of a mess, Lee Minjin. She grabbed his hand and held it tight, refusing to let go when he tried to pull away. You are the biggest mess I have ever met, she continued, tears shining in her eyes. But you are my mess. I am not taking your money. I am taking your hand. And I am staying until the very end, whether you like it or not. Lee stared at her. His mask crumbled. He let out a sob and squeezed her hand back. 2 weeks later, the penthouse balcony was transformed. It was sunset, and the sky was painted in streaks of purple and orange.
There were no hundreds of guests this time.
There were no cameras. It was just Aola, Lee, Dr. Matsuda, and a quiet official to perform the ceremony. Aola wore a simple white silk dress that moved with the wind. She didn't carry flowers. She held Lee's hand. Lee was sitting in a chair because standing for too long made him dizzy, but he looked like a king. He wore a crisp black suit with a white shirt, unbuttoned at the top. The dragon tattoo on his neck was visible, dark and stark against his pale skin. He wasn't hiding who he was. Do you, Lee Minjin, take this woman? The official asked. Lee looked up at Aola. His eyes were clear and full of love. I do, he promised. For all the days I have left. Aola swallowed the lump in her throat. And do you, Aola Badmus, take this man? She squeezed his fingers. I do, she whispered. Forever. She slid a simple gold band onto his finger. He slid one onto hers. It wasn't about the future. It was about right now. When Lee kissed her, it was soft and sweet. The city lights flickered on below them, witnessing the union of the dragon and the janitor. They were married. The clock was still ticking, louder than ever, but for this one perfect moment, time stood still. They had stolen a moment of forever in a season of goodbye. Time became a strange thing inside the penthouse. Since Lee was too weak to travel the world, Aola decided to bring the world to him. She spent the money he gave her, but not on a house. She spent it on memories. One night, she filled the living room with hundreds of fake cherry blossom trees and projected a video of Tokyo streets on the glass walls. They ate sushi and pretended they were in Japan. 2 days later, she hired a string quartet to play French music while they ate croissants, pretending they were in a cafe in Paris. Lee sat in his wheelchair, wrapped in blankets, watching her with eyes full of wonder. He was fading, but his smile was brighter than it had ever been. You are crazy, he whispered one evening as she set up a tent in the living room for an indoor camping trip. I am determined, Aola corrected him. She crawled into the tent next to him. They held hands in the dark, listening to the recorded sounds of crickets and rain. They didn't talk about the tumor. They didn't talk about the doctors or the pain. They talked about their childhoods. They talked about their favorite colors. They crammed a lifetime of dates into a single month. Lee squeezed her hand. I have seen the whole world, he said softly. But this is the best view I have ever had. He wasn't looking at the fake stars on the ceiling. He was looking right at her. For the first time in his life, the dragon wasn't lonely. He was home. The decline happened fast. It wasn't graceful like in the movies. It was brutal and heavy. One morning, Lee tried to stand up and simply couldn't. His legs had stopped receiving messages from his brain. Aola didn't panic. She didn't cry in front of him. She just became his legs. She lifted him. She moved him. She became his hands when his fingers shook too much to hold a spoon. The most heartbreaking moments were in the bathroom. Aola would fill the tub with warm water and essential oils. She would undress him gently, trying to preserve his dignity. Lee, the man who used to terrify boardrooms with a single look, now had to be bathed like a child. He hated it. Aola could see the shame in his eyes, so she kept talking to fill the silence. The water is nice today, she would say, sponging his back. She washed the black dragon tattoo on his neck with a soft cloth. The ink looked stark against his skin, which was becoming translucent and pale. I am sorry, Lee whispered one night as she dried his hair. Tears leaked from the corners of his eyes. You should not have to do this. I am a burden. Aola stopped. She kissed his wet forehead. You are my husband, she said fiercely. You carried me when I was weak. Now I carry you. That is the deal. She lifted him into his wheelchair, her arms strong from years of scrubbing floors. She wasn't just a janitor anymore. She was a warrior protecting her king. Dr. Matsuda called it the surge. He warned Aola that sometimes, right before the end, the patient gets a sudden burst of energy. It is a lie, he said. A final gift from the body to say goodbye. Aola didn't care if it was a lie. She took it. On a Tuesday morning, Lee woke up and asked for breakfast. Real breakfast. He sat up in his wheelchair without help. His eyes were clear, the fog of pain gone for a few hours. Aola wheeled him to the massive window overlooking the city.
It was a bright, sunny day.
The city bustled below them, totally unaware that the man who owned half of it was saying goodbye. Lee looked at the skyline. Then, he turned his chair to face Aola. He reached out and touched her face. His hand was steady. Aola, he said, his voice sounding like his old self. I need to thank you. Aola felt a lump in her throat. For what? For making me human, Lee said. My whole life, I was a weapon. I was a checkbook. I was the dragon. But with you, I was just a man. He smiled, and it was peaceful. You saved me, Aola. You didn't just clean up my messes. You cleaned up my soul. Aola knelt beside his chair and laid her head on his lap. She soaked up every second of his voice, memorizing the sound. They sat there for hours, watching the sun move across the sky, holding on to the light before the final darkness came. It was the best day of their marriage. And it was the last one. The end came 2 nights later. The surge was gone, leaving Lee in a deep, heavy sleep. The penthouse was quiet, except for the rhythmic sound of the oxygen machine. Aola didn't sleep. She sat in the chair beside the bed, holding Lee's hand.
His breathing had changed.
It was shallow and uneven, with long pauses that made Aola's heart stop every time.
She knew this pattern.
The hospice nurse had explained it. It was the body shutting down. The dragon was tired of fighting. Aola leaned close to his ear. It's okay, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. You can rest now. I will be okay. I promise. She smoothed his hair back from his forehead. The black dragon tattoo on his neck seemed to be sleeping too. Go find your parents, she whispered. Go be free. Lee let out a long, soft breath. Aola waited for the next one. She waited and waited, but it never came. His hand went limp in hers. The room felt suddenly empty, as if a massive presence had just walked out the door. The silence was deafening. Aola didn't scream.
She didn't wail.
She just pressed her forehead against his hand and let the tears come. The most powerful man in the city was gone. He didn't die in a shootout or a boardroom. He died in the arms of the woman who loved him. The dragon finally rested. It rained on the day of the funeral. It was a cold, gray rain that soaked the city streets. The cemetery was divided into two sides. On the left stood the underworld, men in dark sunglasses with neck tattoos and scars, looking dangerous and sad. On the right stood the corporate world, the 120 executives from the merger party, looking uncomfortable and terrified. They stood under umbrellas, whispering to each other. Aola stood in the middle. She wore a simple black dress and a black veil. She stood alone at the front of the grave. She wasn't crying. She had cried all her tears in the penthouse. Now, she felt something else. She felt strong. As the coffin was lowered into the ground, Aola turned around. She faced the crowd. Her eyes scanned the group of 120 executives. She saw the same faces that had watched her scrub the floor on her knees. She saw the men who had laughed when Tim Coleman humiliated her. But they weren't laughing now. They looked at her with fear. They knew who she was. She wasn't the janitor anymore. She was Mrs. Lee. She was the sole heir to the dragon's empire. Aola held her head high. She didn't need Lee to carry her anymore. He had given her his strength. She locked eyes with the man who had taken Tim's job. He quickly looked down at his shoes. Aola adjusted her gloves. Black leather this time, not yellow rubber. She owned the building they worked in. She owned their debt. She owned them. The janitor was gone. The queen had arrived. The silence in the penthouse was louder than any noise Aola had ever heard. For weeks, she wandered through the empty rooms like a ghost. She slept on Lee's side of the bed, hugging his pillow, trying to find a lingering scent of his cologne. Grief was a physical weight. It sat on her chest, making it hard to breathe. It made her bones ache. She stopped eating because food tasted like dust. When she started throwing up every morning, she thought it was just the sadness making her sick. She thought her body was rejecting a world without Lee Min-jin in it. But the sickness didn't stop. It got worse. One morning, after spending an hour on the bathroom floor, a strange thought crossed her mind. Her hands trembled as she reached for the phone to call Dr. Matsuda. He came within the hour, bringing a small kit. Aola sat on the edge of the bathtub, staring at the little white stick. 2 pink lines. She blinked, thinking her tears were blurring her vision. She wiped her eyes and looked again. 2 lines. She was pregnant. A sob broke from her chest, but it wasn't a sob of sorrow. It was shock. It was a miracle. She pressed her hand to her flat stomach. Lee wasn't gone. Not completely. He had left a piece of himself behind. She remembered the night before he collapsed, the way he had held her, desperate to live. He had given her one last gift. Aola looked at herself in the mirror. Her face was pale and tired, but her eyes were burning with a new fire. She wasn't just a widow anymore. She was a mother. She had to survive. She had to fight. For him. The boardroom doors were heavy oak, the same doors Lee had walked through months ago to save her. Inside, 12 men sat around the long glass table. They were the board of directors. They were sharks in expensive suits, and they smelled blood. They had called this emergency meeting to remove Aola. They said she was unqualified. They said a former janitor could not run a billion-dollar empire. They expected her to be scared. They expected her to sign the papers and disappear. They were wrong. The doors swung open with a bang. Aola walked in. She wasn't wearing a gray uniform. She was wearing a sharp black suit that cost more than their cars. Her hair was pulled back in a sleek bun. She didn't look at the floor. She looked them dead in the eye. She walked to the head of the table, Lee's empty seat. The room went silent. Aola reached into her designer bag and pulled something out. A pair of bright yellow rubber cleaning gloves. She slapped them onto the polished glass table. The sound echoed like a gunshot. The men flinched. "You think I am weak because I cleaned your floors," Aola said, her voice steady and cold. "But you are wrong. I know where every skeleton in this company is buried because I was the one emptying the trash cans while you whispered your secrets." She leaned forward, placing her hands on the table. "I cleaned up your trash before. I will clean up this company now. Anyone who has a problem with that can leave." No one moved. No one breathed. They looked at the gloves, then at her. They realized the dragon's wife had fire of her own. The labor was long and difficult. Aola lay in the hospital bed, sweat sticking her hair to her forehead. The pain came in waves, tearing through her body. She squeezed the bed rails until her knuckles turned white. She wished Lee were there. She imagined him holding her hand, wiping her brow, telling her she was strong. "One more push, Aola," the doctor urged. "You are almost there." Aola gritted her teeth. She screamed, pouring all her grief and love into one final effort. A sharp cry filled the room. It was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. The nurse wrapped the baby in a soft blanket and placed him on Aola's chest. He was tiny and warm. He had a tuft of thick black hair. Aola touched his small cheek, tears streaming down her face. "Hello," she whispered. "I have been waiting for you." The baby opened his eyes. Aola gasped. They weren't brown like hers. They were dark, intense, and shaped exactly like his father's. They were Lee's eyes staring back at her. It was like looking at a ghost, but a happy one. "Minjin," she whispered. "Your name is Minjin." She held him close, listening to his strong heartbeat. He was the perfect mix of the dragon and the janitor. He was the bridge between two worlds. Aola kissed his forehead. She felt a warmth surround her, a presence in the room that she couldn't see but could feel in her bones. Lee was there. He was watching. He knew his legacy was safe. Aola smiled through her tears. She wasn't alone. She had her son, and she had the memory of the man who had loved her enough to save her life. Years passed and the city changed. The company changed too. Under Aola's leadership, it became a place of respect. She fired the bullies. She promoted the hard workers. She walked through the halls every morning, greeting everyone by name, from the executives to the cleaning staff. She started the Yellow Glove Foundation, a charity that paid for the education of service workers and their children. No one in her city would ever feel invisible again. She raised Minjin with love and discipline. He grew up hearing stories about his father every night. He knew that his father was a powerful man, but he also knew he was kind. Minjin grew tall and handsome, with the same sharp jawline as Lee. When he turned 18, he took his mother to the same arcade where Lee had taken her. They played air hockey and laughed until their sides hurt. People watched them with admiration. They saw a strong, graceful woman and her devoted son. They didn't see a janitor and a mafia prince. They saw a family built on survival. Aola sat on a bench while Minjin went to get them drinks. She watched him walk, noticing how he moved with that same liquid grace as his father. She touched the gold ring she still wore on her finger. She had kept her promise. She had lived. She had built a life full of purpose and kindness. She had turned the pain of her past into power for her future. She knew Lee would be proud. The empire he built with fear, she now ruled with love. And that was the greatest victory of all. The winter snow fell softly outside the window. Aola sat in her favorite armchair, a blanket draped over her legs. Her hair was completely white now, and her face was lined with the map of a long life. Her granddaughter sat on the rug at her feet, looking up with wide eyes. "Tell me again, Grandma," the little girl said. Tell me about the dragon. Aola smiled, her voice raspy with age. He was the scariest man in the city, she began. But to me, he was just Lee. He saved me when no one else would look at me. She told the story one last time. She spoke of the spilled champagne, the yellow gloves, the motorcycle rides, and the brief, burning love that had changed everything. As she finished the story, Aola felt a heavy tiredness settle in her bones. It wasn't painful. It felt like coming home after a long day of work. I am tired now, sweetie, she whispered. I think I will close my eyes for a bit. Her granddaughter kissed her cheek and ran off to play. The room grew quiet. The snow continued to fall. Aola closed her eyes. The darkness wasn't scary. It was warm. Suddenly, the darkness shifted. A light appeared. Standing in the light was a man. He was young.
He was healthy.
He wore a crisp white shirt with the top buttons undone, revealing a black dragon tattoo. He looked exactly the way he did the day he walked into the boardroom. He smiled at her, his dark eyes full of love. He reached out his hand. Come here, janitor, he murmured. Aola smiled. She reached out and took his hand. She was finally free. In the end, remember, from the depths of humiliation can rise the heights of unbreakable strength. What breaks you today can build an empire tomorrow. Embrace your story, own your power, and never let anyone dim your light. If this tale of love, loss, and triumph moved you, hit that like button, subscribe for more inspiring stories, drop a comment with your thoughts or where you're watching from, and share it with someone who needs a reminder of their own resilience. Thanks for watching.